Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session, but making sure you're in the right session. You're in the teaching track. And my colleague today, Damien Babel, and I are going to talk to you a little bit about a blended learning pilot that we did that edX did actually with a couple of local community colleges. Before we dive into kind of the overview of the project and the work we were doing, just a couple of housekeeping administrivia announcements. As you know, most of these sessions are being recorded, and to the extent possible, we want to make this conversational, but at the same time, if you do want to pose a question or talk to other folks in the room, we do ask you to approach the different mic stands and use a microphone, just so the folks online can also hear your question and have the benefit of the full conversation in the room. As you know, the format for this session is Damien and I will kind of give you a 15-minute overview of our project. Given the size, we're a smaller group, so I'm hoping it can be conversational. We have our little timer right there to keep us on track, but usually I have people hold their questions to the end, but I feel like we have a manageable size this morning, and I invite you along the way to ask us to pause, and we're happy to have just keep going with the conversation. Though towards the end of our formal remarks, we'll have questions for you to talk with one another on, and then we'll have a full group dialogue. So once again, welcome. My name's Rebecca Peterson. I was formerly at edX for a couple of years. In the early days, I was the Director of Research and Educational Initiatives there, and just recently, in the last couple of weeks, I moved over to HarvardX to be the Senior Research Manager there and work with the research team at Harvard. I'm joined by my colleague, Damien Babel, who's a psychometrician and works at Boston College in the Graduate School of Education at the Lynch School there. And Damien was gracious enough to join us on this journey. When I joined edX, this project actually is near and dear to my heart, not just because I was the project manager, but it actually drew me to edX because it was a blended learning project. I had worked in education for many years in higher ed and online learning, and I was really intrigued with this idea. This project goes back, its impetus is in July 2012, and it was this idea when MOOCs were not so much new, but a lot of the press attention when the spotlight was on MOOCs in 2012, this idea of being able to bring MOOCs to different populations, or the idea of really open education resources to help other learners or other communities also access MOOCs in different contexts. So that's my personal bias and what got me to edX to help work on this exciting initiative. So our goals today is really to give you an overview of this blended learning experiment. We've talked about blended and flipped along the way the last 2 days. I think there's a lot of interest not just in MOOCs, but what do we do with all these great assets that we create? What is the audience? How does it work in different settings? And to set the context, some of you know this term SPOC. It wouldn't be maybe a MOOC conference without new acronyms or lots of acronyms. Small private online course, or some of us might consider that an online course. So traditional online course, I'll just say it. I just want to make sure for the context in this presentation, a SPOC at edX really, it's a copy of a MOOC course. And so our community college partners at Mass Bay Community College, which Linda Grisham is here, and some of you that were in the Teaching and Learning Lightning Round yesterday got to hear Linda and her colleague talk a little bit about the work. And Jamie Mahoney, who is faculty at Bunker Hill Community College on the project, is also here. Each institution received a copy of an edX course, actually an MIT course, the Intro to Computer Science course. And the idea was, it's locked down. Faculty can add, you can contextualize it, you can put your own announcements in the course, but it's preloaded content it's a copy of the MIT MOOC. And also, a SPOC would allow some data analysis on the back end. So it's a private instance of a MOOC, really. It's a copy of a MOOC that you can use on campus. You can use it online. In this format, we did it as a blended flipped classroom. Real quickly, I've alluded to the timeline. You can see that this project was a fast and furious kind of project. Imagine, if you will, my job was to go around to community colleges in early August. I did agree to do this. This was exciting to me, and find a couple of willing volunteers to agree to do a project that we just kind of came up with the Gates Foundation, but it was a course that was still being built. So it's like we have this introductory computer science course. It's not completely built yet because the MOOC started in October 2012, and we'd like you to offer it in the spring semester of 2013 on campus. And so we were very fortunate that both Mass Bay and Bunker Hill wanted to partner with us on that. But this is the general timeline. Once we got our partners in place, we did spend a lot of time working with the faculty and their teams on campus, bringing them to edX, going to visit them, talking about how this experiment would work. And then we started working with Damien, brought him on board. What was very important to us as well was an external evaluator. So as much as we can declare success maybe in our own way, what we really wanted was an unbiased, unfiltered perspective, and that's where Damien comes in, and he'll talk a little bit more about the research. Real quickly, here are the profiles, and if I'm missing anything, I do invite Linda and Jamie not to be shy. We're all friends. They'll chime in. But very different profiles. They are two-year community colleges here in Massachusetts, slightly different profiles. And I think what's also interesting about the project is we had two different models of implementation. What this means is each campus got a copy of the course, but they really went about implementing it in different ways. And they implemented different amounts of content, which is, I think, actually a really great thing to see the flexibility. So at Bunker Hill, they opted to use the first 7 weeks of the course and paced it differently across the full semester, while Mass Bay Community College used the course in its entirety with its students. Now, a lot of that has to also do with profile of students and recruitment and how the course was placed in the curriculum. This course didn't previously exist in their curriculum. There wasn't a match. So in full disclosure, there was not a real A-B comparison for this study. There was no other real similar course on the community college campus. This is a Python computer programming course, which is not standard in the curriculum here in Massachusetts and community college. And it's also taught through a computational thinking lens. So it's very much problem solving, computational thinking based while learning Python. And so for them, this was very much a pilot of new curriculum. So that's my role right now, to at least set the context and hopefully, and mostly unbiased point of view. I'm going to turn things over, though, to Damien, who's going to talk a little bit more about the framing questions of our project and how we went about doing really what is a formative evaluation. For this first phase of the project, it's been really about a formative evaluation, proof of concept, and with a real focus on what's been happening in the classroom and how are people approaching the teaching and learning and the teaching strategies. So Damien, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. So good morning, everyone. Again, I'm the unbiased evaluator, psychometrician. Show of hands, do you know what a psychometrician is? Show of hands. Pretty good. Okay, a lot of times it's like 2%. Basically, we're data guys, the science of testing, assessment, and measurement. And so when we heard about this project between Gates, community colleges that were just being recruited, and edX, it was pretty exciting, and it opened up a lot of potential questions. And I think if, sitting here with my ears open as sort of the evaluator in me over the last 2 days, it's been really interesting from the keynotes and the lightning rounds and the different sessions, how different people think of success and how we measure success and how we articulate that and then how we share that. And so the first question when I came into the Kool-Aid tank at edX, where everyone was gathered and saying this is great, and the year of the MOOCs was just starting to wind up and I'm learning all I can, I said, how do we evaluate success and how do we know if this is working? And so some of the questions that we threw out there around this specific project, okay? And we're not going to address all of them in the presentation, but we can talk about them. And I think where we have some opportunity for dialogue is how much overlap are your localized implementations asking these same questions? How are you defining success? Is it just course retention? Is it, offering content that was never available before? How do you measure the effectiveness of these things? So, right off the bat, this was a proof of concept type of study. Can a MOOC, can a community college and an organization like edX come together and develop and offer a course like this? Right off the bat, we just want to know, was this possible? Could these grant funds be used to develop and design a course that would then be serving community college students? And I'll jump right to the answer is yes, and we're going to talk about how that worked and why. To what extent, though, were some of these resources needed to be adapted for community colleges students or for different student populations? And there was a lot of talk yesterday about, applying this into high school populations and looking at different specific student populations and how do we consider what those components are for success, okay? How do different types of students respond to the kinds of content and materials that we're seeing in these courses. So this course was really successful when it was taught at MIT in a lecture hall like this. What components of that extract to these different populations? How do the faculty view the effectiveness, both the faculty that are, inside the MOOC coming out of the screen at the students, and the localized faculty, which we're lucky to have at least one of them here today to represent that perspective. What's that like? How much control do you have to give up? How much do you gain? And how do students perceive this? How is this different from just regular online learning? How is this different from other courses they've taken? And as the data guy, we have a lot of opportunities to sort of throw big questions out there around effectiveness once we can figure out what it is we want to measure to show effectiveness. And what are the support mechanisms and things like that. So we wanted to cast a really broad net. We thought that was really important. And we wanted to consider the perspectives of different constituents here. So obviously, we have the perspective of the community college students, the guinea pigs in this study. They were taking a new class for 3 credits. It was real. They were earning credit. They were paying tuition. So we wanted to sort of get at their perception, and we looked at, pre- and post-course surveys and focus groups, and as you can see, we just did a number of quantitative and qualitative ways of trying methods of sort of gathering the perception and experience of those students as they matriculated, hopefully, through the course. We wanted to sort of get the perspective of the instructors, the localized instructors. Here comes one of the largest organizations in the world into their, coming into the classroom and setting up shop and providing content and resources. What's that give and take feel like? What's their perception? What do they gain? What do they lose? So we used observations as well as interviews and surveys to capture that as well. And then the colleges themselves and edX themselves, how do they view success? So one of the first questions is, we went to the community colleges and said, how do you know if this is going to work? How do you evaluate the effectiveness of a course? And what we found is there were some different kinds of answers coming at us, and we had to be really careful to make sure that we weren't valuing, what Boston College thought was the most interesting variable or what edX thought was the most interesting variable here. So we'll get right to the core. The implementation actually went fairly well across the schools, and we'll be talking about that, I think, in the discussion. Both schools sort of, Mass Bay and Bunker Hill, really adapted the course from the get-go to their own needs, both the needs of the instructors, the departments, and ultimately their students, okay? So what we want to look at is, where's the data? Where's the outcomes? I'm a psychometrician. When I heard about MOOCs, I was imagining, big data analysis using, hundreds of thousands of students and looking at, how, do kids who are in, watching lecture number 3 at 2 a.m. seem to have to pause and rewind more than people who are watching it during daylight hours and things like that. And what I realized real quickly is, we weren't going to get there very quickly. We had to really talk about what was going on the ground. And as you can see, we looked at midterm performance. And we wanted to compare this to something, but as Rebecca said, this was a course that had never been offered at either institution. We had no easy A and B. We were sort of making this up as we go along. We did have the MOOC version of this course to compare to. So we could just look at student performance in the midterm at each community college and compare that to about the 12,000 students or so who were still around in the 6OX class when it was offered in fall 2012. And as you can see, the pass rates are, if not comparable, they're actually better. And that across both the community colleges, by midterm, 90% of those students who were still in the class were passing. And compared that to about 60% in the first implementation of the MOOC version of the class. What does this tell us as we go to the end of the year? We look at the final distribution of grades. And this, if you look carefully, includes not just the score distribution, but the overall pass and fail rates, including those students that withdrew or disappeared. Now, it's very hard to find comparable data with the fall MOOC because, again, there were very different objectives for taking the class. Here, we're comparing, credit grant, students who are paying tuition to get 3 credits to someone who really just had to put their email address down and said, yeah, I'm interested in the class. So these are real methodological issues that we need to discuss and bring to the table, I think. But here, we're able to just sort of explore within the community college study what that performance looked like. And a few points that you get from this is the students who managed to stay in the course ended up doing really well. those support mechanisms, the blended learning experience, having the localized instructors, having the graded exercises through the MOOC, all seem to contribute to a pretty positive student experience for a brand new course at a community college with content that pretty much was admittedly pretty tough for a lot of the students. So we see different patterns within the schools. At Mass Bay, we see a little stronger student retention rate overall. I think they started with about 20 students and ended up with 80% of the students passing the course. At Bunker Hill, that number was closer to a little over 50%. And we explored sort of what those issues would be. Overall, over 2/3 of the students that began the class at the community colleges effectively passed the course, got a certificate if they took the full course, and received their 3 credits and moved on. It's really important for me to note that this, again, was content that was never available to these students in their departments. So this is a brand new, how do we sort of quantify the impact of 17 students in a setting getting this resource and content that was not available before. We also can look at what those patterns were for success. And what we see is the students that struggled fairly early on and disappeared fairly early on, even with the resources of doing this in a blended community college setting. So students experienced, overall, most of these students had some online learning experience or had taken a class before. It was rare that they had taken a computer science class online before. So in some ways it was a new experience, in some ways it was similar to things they had before. But when we talked to those students, they said that this, the quality of the blended component, both the edX content and their community college piece in class, really made a difference. And it was that combination of resources that helped them. Specifically, the in-class time, students talked about needing the structure. We had to be in class twice a week. We had to show up and fill a seat. Well, again, there were differences in implementation, but the assumption was that sort of kept them on schedule and on track in a way that we know students in fully online MOOCs we see a lot of different course patterns, completion rates. The course also, the in-class component provided real-world examples. So they could work with a professor, maybe someone they've, in many cases, already had classes with in the past, and sort of see something in their own language and in their own space. That was important. They could get sort of these authoritative answers. They'd view the lectures, they'd contribute to the MOOC, and come into class and say, I'm still really confused about this. And sometimes it was a peer sort of giving them that authoritative answer in class, and sometimes it was an instructor. And we have examples of both of that happening. And the class in and of itself just became an example for everyone to interact. And there were small group activities, there were assessments that were specific to the in-class component. And so the students really seemed to think that those pieces took what they felt was a really hard class and really tough content and made it manageable and doable. And in many cases, they learned a really important programming language or the beginnings of a programming language that had real-world implications for them in their careers. So one thing that was interesting is the effect of the community college instructors themselves. And I don't want to talk too much because we have one here, and I don't want to get it wrong or put Jamie on the spot. But as you can see from the quote, this provided an opportunity for the instructors to also reflect about their practices and what it is they're really doing, and what are the components of their teaching that matter most. And because this was sort of in a blended, flipped environment where a lot of the content and lectures were done outside of class time, it changed the way teachers could structure and use their in-time, their in-class time. Please. Yeah.
Worked together for 2 years. I was going to actually put a pause because I think it isn't, Jamie, I told you I'd put you on the spot. Jamie Mahoney over here, but we're missing a microphone, I just noticed, on this side. Oh, it's back there. Could Jamie get the mic? I think it's a good pause point because I think, Jamie, do you mind just sharing a little bit more from the faculty perspective, just discussing with your...
What specifically? I don't want to ramble.
No, you can ramble away, but just kind of this experience of, what you're hearing from the data side, like this is the outcome. But could you talk a little bit about your experience getting to that outcome, like the path? and what it was like in the classroom with the students. I think that would be really useful.
Sure. I think the biggest challenge was that this was an MIT course that had been taught to MIT students, and that the online MOOC was that implementation. So the assumptions made about MIT students are not the same as the assumptions or what is true about community college students. And so one of the biggest challenges was figuring out how to adapt it for community college students, whether that was pacing, which is one thing that we did at Bunker Hill. We adjusted the pacing. We also set that no students were required to have anything above like college algebra for our implementation, and as a result, that created a lot of challenges because there was quite a bit of math in the course. We also were very intentional about the flipped model at Bunker Hill, and that meant that we did things like, and actually I learned this from San Jose State, from edX, had San Jose State come out and talk to us a little bit about their experience. And so they talked about doing quizzes in class to assess whether students were watching the material online, because if they're not watching the lectures, then they're going to have a difficult time. And so we wanted to ensure that they were, and they were understanding the content, not just watching it, but understanding what was being presented. And so we used Google Forms to assess whether the students, they just took a little Google Forms quiz that was anonymous at the beginning of the class that allowed us in real time to look at the data that showed, oh wow, 80% of the students in the class didn't understand this concept. They got the answer to this question wrong and didn't understand the concept. And so in real time, we would stop and address that problem in class. We also used some peer projects, so students worked together in projects in class and served as, peer learning and things like that. Did I address what you wanted? Yeah, just to give a little more context. But it was incredibly interesting and wonderful experience, so we'll say that.
And they did it again. They volunteered.
That's true.
Yes. On the road.
You need one too, so you can take this one.
It's that whole video.
The online people, oh yeah, the online people. So we're doing a similar thing. We're trying to build a course for UCS Community College for high school. So there'll have a lot of high school teachers of varied experience. If you don't mind my asking, what was your fluency with Python? Just to see, because we have some high school teachers who are trying to launch our course who actually are very new to computer science, and some who have masters in Dan Garcia, Berkeley. So some high school teachers have masters in computer science. So it doesn't matter. We found it doesn't matter. So what was your fluency?
So this is a fabulous question to ask me because I am not a computer scientist. So I was teaching, and I have no programming background. So I was co-teaching at Bunker Hill. We had 2 instructors. So I was sort of the one that was tapped because I do flip classroom very easily. It's most of how I teach. The other instructor I was teaching with, Jefferson Fernandez, is a computer scientist, has a bachelor's degree in computer science, not a master's degree, but did know programming. However, didn't know Python per se. So we very much in real time, we were actually taking the MOOC that started in October while we were doing this project. So we were learning as we were adapting. So it's possible to do that. It's challenging and time consuming, but it was an amazing experience, so.
Thank you.
Don't give that up. So while you've got the microphone, you said you do a lot of flipped classroom, and you mentioned the strategy of having them do the quizzes in class so that you could address those immediate. What did you do, and was it a problem about students who, if a lot of the students didn't watch the videos? Because one of the challenges we always raise about the flipped classroom is, coming up with good strategies to make sure they do come to class prepared. So what were other ways, and what were like the penalties?
So there were no penalties per se, other than they knew that they were required to complete all the MIT content. So those projects, those tests were coming. And if they didn't do the projects, if they didn't watch the videos and they didn't do the projects in class, they were going to be in trouble. But one of the things we did was, I think peer pressure works very well. So they had group projects that they had to work on in class together. And the groups sort of kicked each other in the butt and said, you're not not contributing enough to this project. You need to, here, let me explain this concept to you. Let me, continue to encourage you along. And that helped quite a bit. So that would be the one other strategy. We had these projects they worked on in class together. We intentionally, in the beginning, we started kind of letting them pick their own teams, and then later we kind of intentionally paired stronger students with students that maybe weren't as strong.
Can I ask a quick question about the group projects? Sure. So this is about the group projects. So I've worked a little bit on a flipped classroom. It's the Challenges of Global Poverty class here taught at MIT. And when they have the group projects in class, it's typically application of concepts they've learned in the lecture. Was that what the group projects were like that you worked with? And one way of sort of maintaining accountability, of getting people to actually take the project seriously, was people were randomly picked to present these group projects at the start of the year. I was just wondering what sort of devices you used.
We didn't randomly pick. Each group had to, or at least 3 of the groups had to present their code at the end of the project. So they had to, not only did they have to present it, here it is up on the board, but they had to explain it. And what was really useful about that is not everybody, particularly when you're a new programmer, programs the same way, uses the same programming logic. And so it was really helpful, I think, to the students, because they said, well, I don't understand the program logic that first group used, but the second one, oh, that makes sense to me. Because they were new, so we weren't dictating what kind of loops they had to use per se or things like that. So they could use different strategies to get to the end goal in the project. But yes, they had to present them. So again, it was a lot of peer kind of pressure to get that stuff done.
Hi, I'm Ursula Wools. I have a startup to try to create some of the technology that wraps around MOOCs, but as Dan knows, I've been teaching computer science for longer than some of you have been alive. When I first started hearing the questions from all of you directed at someone who just started, I had to think about something that Dr. Clark said, which is about, please go back to the literature. There is a 30-year literature on how to bring down the content to students who do not have the same preparation as you do at MIT. I'm also an MIT grad, 40 years ago this fall. Not a computer science major. But to put this in a positive spin, and I've already chatted, you guys have to take this to the SIGC conference. The proposals are due at the beginning of September, and if you don't want to write it, I will help you write this. Okay, because there's a huge disconnect here. Okay, the SIGC, the Special Interest Group for Computer Science Education, horrible acronym. We've been looking at this problem, okay? Almost 1,000 of us get together every year, okay? We have a journal, we have a couple of different venues, and this point about how do you do this in the classroom, what kind of projects do you do, how do you focus on the project? I was a high priestess of logo back in the dark ages. I put down my sword, I made plowshares. Dan, language, it depends on the culture, it depends, we know all of this, okay? We have a huge body of information about it. What's critical about the MOOCs is that what we also know, and there's good literature and there's good data collection on it, is that textbooks don't work because the kids don't read them. Okay, so we abandoned the old-fashioned read this, come to class, and I will present it model. We've been doing lab-based, project-based stuff for 20 years. And again, I think the MOOCs have a place in this because of the way the information is presented. And it's not learning styles, it's that presentational thing, that ability to model and do it, which is so critical.
It's a really good point, and I think I'm going to get out of the way here and let the conversation go. I'm going to make a few more little points around the data. We did look, there was a textbook for the course, and it was distributed to the students, and for free, actually, and when, about midterm, the students, and what we found is overall the sentiment around the textbook was really low. And when we dug a little deeper, we found that there was a difference between students who had prior programming experience. They loved the textbook. They thought, I can look up anything, I can find it in the textbook. The students that didn't have prior programming experiences in the class thought the textbook might as well have been in a different language. And so at MIT, that textbook was incredibly effective for most of that student population who had traditionally taken the course. When we exported it to these other settings, we found it was much more nuanced. And as you can see, you know, these were the percent of students who were computer science majors. And when we looked at why some students were more successful in the class and why some were not, this is what mattered. It was, again, their prior experience with computer science, their prior experience having passed programming languages. For those students who walked in and had never programmed, they found not only the textbook, but the course very challenging. For those students that had a little bit of experience, they were able to run with it. And again, this is an example of the nuance of the locale and the population. And you're absolutely right, and that we're sitting on decades of research around teaching and learning with different populations.
Can I jump in on your textbook thing for just a
Sure.
second to be clear about this? Again, I mean, I keep up with the culture at MIT, the student culture. And I lived in a wonderful dorm 40 years ago, and it's still a wonderful dorm. And I think the piece that's being left out of this conversation is that surrounding culture that we haven't been able to capture in forums. And part of the reason I know this is I also hang out with Lynn Stein over at Olin, who was here as a computer science professor. And I worked with her for a year at Olin, and we talk about this, about the culture that surrounds it. So perhaps part of what you're seeing with the textbook is that we didn't read textbooks 40 years ago either. Okay, ours were cheaper and better, okay?
Yeah.
Because what we did is we did problem sets in groups. And upperclassmen helped their lower class, not lower class, that's the wrong word, the freshmen and sophomores. Okay, there was this huge body, and this is true on any campus, is if you belong to a fraternity, you have an incredible edge in terms of deciphering a textbook. And that's something the MOOCs need to think about as well, is not just the forums, but the face-to-face conversations that
And
happen.
I really feel that this is an opportunity for educational research to really make a contribution, because we can measure a lot of that. And I mean, we're just looking at computer science experience. This is really simple, you know, how many classes have you taken, what's your experience? And we're showing that the nuance really does matter. And this isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all. So again, some of the takeaways are that one, this happened. They did it. It was successful. Students got credit. Both institutions voluntarily ran this again with new crops of students. We weren't expecting that. In fact, I think it was a little bit of a surprise for everyone. But everyone sort of felt coming out of the class that this really worked. Let's offer this class next semester. And did again successfully and actually learned from the first implementation. So, you know, there were tech issues, you know, as with any type of new deployment, there's going to be issues, but I think it was nice to have an outsider to be able to sort of come in and look and steer and help provide more data and feedback to the project partners across the board. And so, you know, we wanted to sort of lead with some just bigger discussion questions too, and I think we're already getting there. But these are kind of the points that we have moving forward. And I know Linda is...
Yeah, Linda, so I'm assuming some of these get at to some of the questions that are maybe popping around in your own minds and the discussion we can have as a group. As we get to the questions over here, I'll just say it's full disclaimer and disclosure. I still, with this particular project, it's not that it was like weird tension with how did we define success. This is, you know, it's come up yesterday in multiple sessions, and I don't know, we were having this conversation at Harvard the other day with a group of folks about just in general, there is a lot of literature. Instructional design and online learning has been around for a while. I think there's this assumption of tying things to learning objectives and outcomes that it hasn't been as transparent in the MOOC realm. And one of the things with this project, because we didn't really have a comparison study or a course quite like it on either of the campuses, is everybody kind of declared victory and success, which, great. You know, the faculty agreed, the administrators agreed, and the students agreed. How often does that happen with a project on a campus? And I don't know how much, you know, is that the feel good, kind of like it worked, and we were just like, we had maybe the bar, we just felt like, oh gosh, we have no idea what this is gonna be like, and we all came out of it and did no harm in any way. But I still think this is a I mean, Linda will add to that, but I think it's a bigger conversation on like how do we think about projects like this as a success, and a success-only completion? You know, in the bricks and mortar world and our face-to-face credit bearing, it's always kind of measured by, did the student complete the course and pass? And is there even space, I would challenge us, in credit conversations that success is broader than just, did you get a passing grade and get it on your transcript? I would think yes, is my bias. But we don't always, that's not important in the bigger dialogue, I think. Maybe not in this room, because we all have we're very passionate about this, but I'll leave it at that. We have a gentleman behind you, and then, well, Linda, why don't you go? Linda was part of the project as well.
Hi, I'm Linda Grisham. I'm from Mass Bay Community College, and I'm part of the project, and I've sat in a lot of, Hal Riggs was the professor who was doing that and was also part of the planning. One of the things I liked about the project was it really looked at what it was that students needed. There was a lot of conversation in the beginning about how the two groups of students were the same or different, since at Mass Bay, we have a computer science program, and the instructor, Hal Riggs, has been teaching a Python programming course, and was felt when we looked at the edX course, that was a course that we actually needed, since it was on problem solving with a computer, not just straight programming and stuff. So that's another reason why it's being run, and it's going to become a permanent course. So what was going on for the Mass Bay students was that Hal was very experienced in teaching Python, so he had some good idea about where people have issues with, and so he could look at the edX material in a way sort of translated into that, and he created a whole set of weekly interactive tutorials that students went through. And so it was almost like the equivalent, a way of so there weren't exams or quizzes or anything like this, but that was a way that he could keep track of what were students, what did they understand, what they didn't understand, and then they were in the classroom, and obviously they're having all these really interesting conversations, and people are helping each other and everything like that. So that was going on at Mass Bay.
Dan Grossman from the University of Washington. I think this whole project is looking at the right things, and that bringing MOOC materials into classrooms is a very natural growth area, particularly because we've brought external resources into our classroom for decades, and these are new resources and new things available. What I was hoping to hear a little bit more from all of you, whoever wants to jump in, is a little bit more about the initial framing of the MOOC materials presented to the students, because my intuition is that we can come up with a set of best practices there that would be very effective. There's a big difference between saying, hey everyone, we're gonna sit here and take this MIT course, versus, hey everyone, we have a set of videos that are gonna be helpful to us, you know, as we learn this material. Just little things like that. I think you could also, you know, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to frame what's going on, and I didn't get a lot of that yet from the presentation.
I can start a little bit, but I will call on Jamie and Linda a little bit more. Yes, Dan. Thankfully, I think we knew early on in these project team meetings, how is this going to work? And a lot of it comes down to how important context is and contextualization and knowing your learner community. And both campuses, and I think community colleges in general, and like they really know their students, and could sit there and look at the MIT course, understand I should remember this because we talked about it so much. I'm looking at Jamie. There was a particular problem set. Bunker Hill knew their students could do it, but the language, the terminology and the language was so up here that they had to figure out a different way to like say to their students, like, this is, and I know because you're scarred for life from it, and I should have remembered. Maybe it was there was a certain problem solving, and just a lot of it was terminology and making the course accessible, and then also giving examples. And I would also say, I know at Bunker Hill, a lot of the project-based learning was being able to take the theoretical and put it directly into practice. And Jamie, do you want to give the robot, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I think this is all right, and I think you have to continue to adapt the content, knowing your community. But I was more curious about the beginning, before you get into it. You know, things like, presumably, you know, saying, well, look, this MOOC could be taken for free, but here at the community college, we're providing you value in the following ways. And I think I have my guess on what those are, but I imagine that conversation happened with students, and the whole experience was set up in a certain way that others could learn from right at the beginning.
Yeah. So definitely the first run, there was a lot of like, you can take this MIT level course here. and do this, you'll get credit for it. If you the kicking point was if you passed all the materials that the MOOC students did, you could even earn an honor code certificate. But you had to do all of the work that the MOOC students did. And clearly not each campus didn't do that completely, the students had choice. So there was that initial kind of excitement, and it came out even in the focus groups, that students actually like this idea of the challenge, that it's different, I can challenge myself, I can see in a fairly safe environment, quite frankly, and in a supported environment. There were a couple of registrants I thought at Bunker Hill also, because they'd read about it, that weren't matriculated students, but had taken the MOOC online in the fall. And they wanted to do it with guided practice in the spring, and so they chose to become student. They registered for this course at Bunker Hill so they could do it in the context of the classroom and kind of get the things that they missed. So there was this kind of idea of, I want to do MIT level work. Now, I guess my question back out to Linda and to Jamie was, by the second semester, because you elected to do this again and continue to do it, is that the same hook, or are people more now hooked on the content? Because the other piece we heard from the students was, we don't get Python right now in the community college curriculum, and this is very relevant, and I need it from an employability standpoint. Like, it just isn't in the curriculum right now, and it was a quick way, and this is where I think administrators really hopped on board, to do a proof of concept pilot of new curricula without investing a lot of the resources in developing it. And I don't know if Linda or Jamie, you want to add to my summary.
The second implementation was very different at Bunker Hill.
I'm going to give you
mostly computer science students, whereas our first implementation was mostly what I would call IT students that didn't have any experience in programming. So that, I would say, the second implementation had more to do with computer science students who wanted Python than it did with, it being an MIT course. They were less enamored by that and more, I want this content, I can't get it anywhere else, and I want to see if I can do it. All of the students, though, were really interested in, can I do MIT quality work? Can I do an MIT course? And one of the things that I think both campuses are most proud of is our students did MIT work. I mean, they took the same exams, the same finger exercises, the same same assignments that the individuals did in the MOOC that was an MIT course. There was a ramp up, particularly at Bunker Hill. We structured projects and problems that was based on the concepts, but that would be similar to what they would see in the assignment. Not the same, but like I'm gonna do an algebra problem that looks the same as something I might see in an assignment or in an exam. So in terms of the framing question, to get back to that, I think the students were definitely drawn that it was an MIT course. Could they do it? They wanted the challenge. They wanted Python. We set it up as, you're going to do this half of the course in this many weeks, and here's all the things we're going to do to get you there, to be able to, ramp you up, to be able to handle this content. Here's all the ways, if you don't understand a video, how we're going to address that in class. So that's kind of was the framing, if that makes sense. Here's all the supports we're going to provide. We even went down to the level of, I said, I'm not an expert programmer. Your programming questions, they're mostly going to go to my colleague. I'm going to help, structure this and things like that. So it was very transparent what we were going to do, I think, to the students. And that's, I think, how we made most of them more comfortable.
So one thing very interesting, it's very nice to see that this blended model happening. However, when you look at these classes, most of them are point solutions. So you have one class in this entire program. And in fact, if you look at something like edX, it's again an eclectic collection of point solutions. So I think one of the biggest opportunities in MOOCs is, what does it take to put a program together? Because, for example, there are a lot of, one example in the development country settings, there are a lot of places where the quality of education is very low. And if there's a full program, you can say soup to nuts, here's somebody who will do from the beginning when they come, and at the end, if you follow these, whatever 20 classes, you can have a certifiable degree. If you can do that, putting together, I think there'll be a lot more takers, and there'll be a lot more places you can say, look, I will have a MOOC certified degree that I'm offering. But unfortunately, the problem right now I see is the MOOCs is basically, it's donations from all these places with these individual modules. How do you make them fit together into a curriculum, or what's the time frame you'll see that something like that will happen?
That's a really good question, and before Rebecca gives you a really good answer, I'll make the point that when we were asking, as the evaluator coming in, he said, what does success look like? How do we measure this? And I asked Anant, our first meeting, before this all started, and he said, how do I know, we're starting this project, I'm looking at outcomes, I'm reading up on the literature, what do we know? And he says, well, the overall goal, just to put this in context, is to destabilize higher education. And I had a full head of hair when he said that. So.
Thank you for handing me the mic. Thanks for that segue. It's probably because I interrupted you earlier. I don't, Saman, I don't have an answer. I mean, I could have a really flip answer that reflects my 20-year career in higher ed and K-12, which is we got to get out of our own way, right? And I think, people want to know that it works. People, at the end of the day, people really want to innovate, but in a very safe way. And so a project like this, when it was hatched 2 years ago, in MOOC years is 10 years, in this particular span of MOOC time, in the ex-MOOC era is like 10 years ago, I feel. We needed someone to be willing to try. When I say get out of your own way, everybody at these campuses was incredibly supportive. I mean, and so I think it's possible, but that really great and rare alignment of senior, right from the president's office to the provost, through the dean, to the faculty, to the students, in sync to get something like this done. And I think the way you really get momentum in that is for the student. Community colleges, I feel, not that we're not student-centric on our other campuses, but these are very student-centric places. And they're very passionate about their students. Like I said, not that we aren't in other areas of education. And I found in this project, people wanted to see if it worked. But what we aren't seeing is, so as these little pilot studies come out saying, yes, it did, we're not seeing a lot of momentum in other areas where people want to also take that same risk or work together. So, and not unless you know them, and it's like, and then how do we bring those people together?
Please go to a place, like if you try to operate community college, they already have high levels of bar. You have to set something higher to enter there. But there's a large part, especially international, where the bar is so low. So if you offer something, at least some coherence, that would be so much better than what they have. And I think you can have a much bigger play in that environment. Like for example, to get a MOOC into MIT is much harder, so you're very high bar. Whereas in some of those places, especially if you have a package thing, you can say, look, you can, instead of this, because to plug and play a few things, they have to have other things. When you have a place that's nothing, you can't offer 3 classes.
Yep. Can I say something about that? Yes, and then I know you've been waiting patiently, and Linda's, no, you.
The one thing that I want to say about this is I think that, and Damien, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that this showed that MOOCs aren't sort of a one-size-fits-all, or at least this course wasn't. That's quickly what we kind of discovered. It said this isn't, we have to make modifications to this to make this work on our campuses, and I'll at least speak for Bunker Hill from that standpoint. To do what you're describing, is difficult. And not impossible, but difficult. Right, and anybody who wants to work with Bunker Hill and be specifically, come see me. I'm interested, but I agree with you. But what I will say is kind of what I said yesterday, which is nobody's knocking on my door asking for me to do that. So.
They don't even know the possibility. So that's educational.
Okay, shout, Linda. And then we'll go over. I know you've been waiting so patiently. I'm actually next to Burger. And Emily, and then.
I think that what you brought up is an excellent question. I mean, the thing is that yesterday people were talking about community and how we share and stuff. The community colleges have a lot of experience about doing this. Jamie and her group have a whole set of ways to get through this course. Hal now has another way. We don't have a way to share that. There's not like an open ethics course that we could append and say, here's a set of exercises to do. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that's missing, so how do you get from here to here?
So that was actually my question. This has been my question for a while, is what, I've been hearing a lot about modifications and adaptation, and what is the community side of it to sort of share practices across different institutions, but what about the platform could be changed to help you as an instructor modify and adapt to your local context?
So let me start with the positive. The platform was incredibly rich for programming. It did things that I've never seen an online platform do. So let me start with that. There were finger exercises that were built into this. There were auto graders that would grade programming that was written in multiple different ways and grade it correctly. That's really, really hard to do and really, really sophisticated, and that was amazing. The students didn't love the videos. They thought sometimes they were long, sometimes they were, which is less about the platform, that they maybe could be chunked into smaller pieces, that there could be more physical world examples. And I think over time we actually talked about that, and there were more physical world examples added. There was a basketball shooting hoops one, I think, and a couple other ones that were added as we were talking through this. Well, edX added them. That's what the beauty of this project was. That I have to sing the praises of is they were really interested in how do we make this better for more students, and interested in what we had to say, which isn't always the case. And so as we were doing this project, we said, it would be really great if you had an example here of that was a physical, real world touch feel example of this concept. And they ran with it, and they created videos to do that. So there's no massive negatives about the platform per se. Does that make sense? Correct. Yeah, you're not. And the biggest negative I can say is that some of it was, and you alluded to this, some of it was in MIT speak. So some of our students had to stop and look up words because these aren't words that are used in everyday language at a community college or even by most of us. Some of them were these really long sentences. I remember one sentence, I'll pick on myself, one sentence that was used by one of the instructors that I had to stop and listen to 5 times. And I have a master's degree, 5 times before I understood what he meant because it was just a complex, long sentence with, some large words. Yes.
I have a couple of questions maybe around the economics of some of this. The first one is really, I think there's an analogy between textbook publishing and course publishing, and whether having the right economic model will allow MIT to create a course that's targeted, or not necessarily MIT, but targeted at the community college. And if so, what were the incentives for the original faculty at MIT? Was that person paid, that faculty? Just one of the concerns on our faculty side is what happens to the course, the faculty ownership of that course once it goes to other schools. And the second,
I don't think we have the competence to do to a different set of students than we are capable of. MIT created MIT students. If somebody else has to pick up to understand that community really well, to cater to that community.
it doesn't have to be MIT.
Well,
and the second question was really about the 47% of the other students who I'm assuming paid tuition and didn't make it. Did they retake that class? How did you deal with that? 47% to me seems like a very large number who I think at Bunker Hill did not make it and paid whatever the tuition is. What were the interventions to help those students get through on the next turn? Again, a little bit of economic issue there.
Sure. We'll come back to the bunker for a minute. I can't speak to all the MIT legality. It's very situational, at least in early MOOC days. When this was one of the first courses mounted on the edX platform in fall of 2012. And the faculty team were John Goodtag, who's taught here forever, and is co-taught the course also with, why can't I think of the former provost chancellor's name, Eric Grimson. Thank you very much, with Eric Grimson and Chris Terman and others. And they very much wanted to do this. This is something they were very interested in. And I know for John, who authored the textbook, he's very keen on understanding how a course like this can be used broader. I think the economic model and the whole compensation, that becomes, every institution addresses this differently. In my experience, in my travels through edX and beyond, it's very different and it's very situational. But what I will say in the context of this course, real quickly, like some of Jamie's examples of like, this didn't make sense and this is crazy. The faculty here was incredibly interested in how the community college experiment went. They wanted to understand how to make this class more accessible to the MOOC community. They have fundamentally changed how this course runs. Now as a MOOC, it's going to be offered, it's been offered multiple times. Jamie's and her team and Jefferson, also Mass Bay, saw after 7 weeks, there's a natural kind of breaking point in this course. Guess what? This MOOC now is taught in 2 7-week chunks. It's no longer a whole 14-week. They've made a lot of adjustments and tweaks based on the work of this. And it's also influenced John, particularly the lead faculty, on how he's thinking about the residential campus experience here, and also how he proceeds with the textbook. Now, it doesn't answer all your economic questions, clearly, but I think these are things that the institution is much more invested in this process, not just for, how do we, how does it impact here at MIT? How do we make it better for others? I think people just want to break even, and I think we haven't been able to crack the nut to how do we get it, that's the big challenge. We want other people to use this, and how do we make it accessible to all? I know Carrie has had a question, I know Armando. Do you want to follow up on this, and you have a question? Okay.
Yeah. If you want, sorry, Armando Fox from UC Berkeley. If you want one additional data point, we have 2 or 3 courses at Berkeley that are being used in a very similar format, not with community colleges per se, but certainly with various schools where the overall preparation of the students is not maybe as high as the Berkeley students the courses were aimed at. And in all of those cases, it's basically the same model Rebecca described. The faculty are not being compensated over and above what they usually do, but from their point of view, the value is understanding how their material can be used by more students. In most cases, they are using those lessons to improve their campus course, and there is some psychic income to having your course and your material be associated with many more people who appreciate being able to get at the material. So far, you might get a little teaching relief, but there's, nobody's being paid for this right now. They see it as pedagogical research and a way of advancing their educational agenda.
I'm going to go here because you've been very patient, then up to Ani, and then to Carrie for the last word. I'm just looking at time.
I just have a really fast question about the relationship between MOOCs and then the blended learning part of this, because when the MOOC was created, it was created for a different setup completely. Mm-hmm. And from what I'm hearing, the usual face-to-face interaction is to help you get through the MOOC course. And the idea was, for me, when I think about blended learning, it needs to be a little bit more than that. Not that I'm saying that this is necessarily wrong, because I do believe that there are many different ways of doing things. And then one of them, reusing resources, and the MOOC is a resource that I think should be used in whichever way. But I was just curious about whether you thought about it in that way, in a blended learning way, or maybe in the next steps, maybe be more blended and have it more seamless rather than it just being almost tutorial support sessions for the MOOC course. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, or if this was the case, but I'm just curious as to.
And I think you raise an interesting when you say blended, and what we didn't, usually we cover this, I don't know how we missed it today. This will be like the hallway conversation at lunch. What is blended and what is flipped? These are very, very vague terms anymore. We use them very interchangeably. I've come from the old school framework of blended does imply some sort of seat time replacement and a credit bearing, like you can replace some of the time you're coming to class with online time, and flipped means that you're still coming all the time to your assigned course sections and you're doing some of your homework online. Like that's my very simplistic view, but this is now very hazy. We use these terms interchangeably, not necessarily exclusively. I will say in the Mass Bay model, I would say Hal did it really as the more traditional blended. Like he gave students the option, they didn't have to come all the time. Some chose to come to class all the time, but many of the students could do more of a true blended implementation where they were coming when they needed to, like once a week as opposed to the 2 to 3 times. Yes, his minimum setup is you needed to come to class at least once a week. Where Bunker Hill was, you had to come all the time, which was more flipped. So, but I think it's a good point, and that's a whole other discussion. Ani, and then if people are patient, we can go another minute over, and then we'll conclude for lunch. This has been a good conversation. Ani?
Right, so I'm Ani Adhikari, Berkeley, and I wanted to say that the point you raised about, the economics, and essentially it was a point, I think, about sustainability of this, is a very critical one, because, once somebody has done this, what's their motivation to do it again? And, the psychic joys are wonderful, and I have them aplenty, but psychic is going to sustain us only for so long. So I won't say more about that, except to say that I hope you're going to be here at 12:30, because that's half of what I'm going to talk about. But I do have a question about those two last points that you have there.
Mm-hmm.
What are the optimal conditions for blending or flipping a classroom? And how do you blend a MOOC in my own campus? Because on my campus, the classes are large. And when I see 20 students, right, what I'm looking at is one of my discussion sections of my 300-person class. All right, and so then the economics become very, very important. The economics also for the student's time. If I expect a student to go through my MOOC at home, they are doing the equivalent of a week's lectures at home, and then if I expect them to come and be in class for a full, 3 hours a week or whatever it is, they're essentially doubling their time in lecture, and that is a very expensive thing for a student. Their time is extremely limited. And, especially in community colleges, many of them are working to make ends meet. That is a difficult, difficult thing to ask of them.
I will say, so Jamie and Linda, and we can talk more after this for those of you that want to linger a little bit.
If somebody has 1 minute to address that, I would appreciate it.
We didn't double their time. There was, and I think that is the common misstep. It's like, do this and do this.
Right.
This was, we were tracking, and it was like, what are you doing out of class and what are you doing in class? Being very deliberate to ensure that we weren't being duplicative or creating, basically doing 2 courses in the space of 1, And that's just, for the sake of time, I can't elaborate, but for those of you that I hang back, we can talk a little bit more about that. Carrie, you get the last word, so no pressure, and then we'll conclude for lunch.
Thank you. And like other things, that's that mistake of creating a course and a half by adding in the technology has been a common mistake for the last 15 years, and we need to not do that anymore. There's a ton of literature on it. Anything about blended learning can guide you in that direction. I wanted to follow up on being able to help teachers use this content in their courses, especially when it's very high level, high quality content, and the students aren't ready for that for various reasons. I work for Canvas Network, and we just launched this major K-12 initiative with MOOCs looking at we did market research. We went out and we talked to teachers at K-12 schools all over the Southwest, and they just want content. Give us content, give us content, give us content. Well, we're creating some pretty fantastic content in the MOOC world. We need to liberate that content. Not only that, but we need to help them learn how to implement it because they don't always know. So anything that we can do, we might not spend time creating specific lesson plans, but if you have thought of 10 different activities you could use in your class, but you're only using 3 in your MOOC, create a page in your MOOC that lists out these other ideas so that teachers can implement them. If you're creating videos, put them on YouTube or Vimeo so teachers can curate what they want for their course, whatever is appropriate without being limited to just what you've curated for the course. So if we can liberate this content, think OER, think remix, let people use it in a way that meets their audience, and that's the best contribution we can give to education.
And on that note, thank you, Carrie, and thank you all for coming. And thank you, Jamie and Linda.